Hi, this is Eric from Longbox Review at longboxreview.wordpress.com. Welcome back to the show. I know it's been a while. Actually, it's been unexpected. I certainly did mean to release new episodes long before 5 weeks from the last one. So what have I been up to? Well, I'm actually sitting in my basement office on a rare day when I'm away from work. I took the day off today. And the house is empty aside from me and our two dogs who are in the other room and hopefully won't bark and make a noise. So I thought I'd come down here and get back into it. I've been away unexpectedly, as I said, because of various things. It being summer and all, we take extra trips in the summer, like most people, I think. And some stuff at work was happening. And I really didn't feel like doing a whole lot of recording or anything else for that matter. My wife says I was probably a little depressed. I don't know about that, but all I know is that I didn't feel like doing much of anything besides coming home from work, maybe watching a little bit of TV, although I didn't do much of that, with one exception, if I may stray. And actually, I probably will do that quite a bit for this episode. But we got into and devoured, really, Downton Abbey, which is a fantastic British show set in the early 20th century, leading up to World War I, and follows the lives of an upper crust family in Britain, along with their servants, and everything goes on there. It's a really great show. Not comic book related, but I kind of geeked out on it for a couple weeks there. And as did my wife, who is not not someone I normally associate as a geek. So she was really into it and actually pushing me to watch the show sometimes more than I was pushing her to watch it. So there was some TV watching in there. I did read a lot of comics. I got way behind. Basically read all of July's comics, and I'm working my way through August's comics. And I just received notification from DCB Service that my next stack of comics for the first 2 weeks of September are coming my way. So I'll have those next week. Oh, before I get any further, I should mention, as I have neglected to do, and I should do that more often, the Longbox Review podcast is a proud member of the Comics Podcast Network. And also, Longbox Review is now on Stitcher for those that like to use that. Plus the usual places on the web at longboxreview.wordpress.com. I have a Facebook page where there's a link to the episodes. You can go there as well if you'd like to do that. But anyway, so I thought I'd take this opportunity on this episode, since I have been away for a bit and I had a 5-week hiatus. If comic books can do that, not come out monthly, I think perhaps I could do that with my podcast. I hope not to do that again, especially more than this amount of time. I know in the past, if you've been with the Longbox Review podcast from the beginning, and thank you if you have, I appreciate that very much. You will see, or you have noticed, that there are gaps where longer gaps than this one, where I have not released a new episode. And going into 2012, that was kind of my New Year's resolution, so to speak, was to focus on the podcast and get more episodes out and more regularly. And I was doing pretty good there for a little while, but like I said, some stuff happened in my life, and I decided just to take a break from everything and just kind of recharge my batteries a little bit. I have some really great ideas for things that I want to do for the podcast. Those are going to come out, hopefully, as I said, more regularly and soon. So we'll get to those. But like I was saying, if comics can take a hiatus, then and then come back, fresh and ready for the new chapter in the story, I could do that here. But I thought I would do that by, ironically enough, taking a step back and just kind of talking about who I am what am I up to here with this podcast? I mean, obviously it's a comic book related podcast. I talk a lot about the comics I'm reading. I talk about the news, events in the comic book world, that kind of a thing, sure. But I don't believe I've ever really talked about myself and why I do this. So I thought I'd take this opportunity with episode 32 to give you some background on myself and my comic reading habits and that kind of a thing. And then take a look forward and see what I'm doing, what I plan on doing, and why I'm doing it, etc. So who is Eric? Well, I'm a 30-year plus comic book reading veteran. I started reading comics back in approximately October 1978. And I remember this specifically because my mother and father had divorced that summer, and she moved me and my brother and sister out to this desolate desert town in south central Washington, where there wasn't a whole lot there besides the desert and the bitter cold. Even this summer, I remember how cold it got in that town. It was ridiculous. And then when winter hit, it was even worse. But that's when it was in that little town where I started collecting comics. And, for obvious reasons, I am how old was I back then? I was 10 or 11. So it would have been 78. So let me do the math, which I'm not very good at. I would have turned 12 that very year. Yes, so I was on the cusp of being 12 years old. I'm in a new town. I don't know anybody. I'm separated from my friends and family, and got nothing to do really, especially during the summer before school started. But anyway, let's fast forward through the summer, get to the fall, and my mother is dating this one guy. I don't even remember his name. And for some reason, I go to the corner market. I don't know if it was on a corner. It was a small little market. You go in and, you got everything in there. Kind of like how gas station convenience stores are now, where there's a little bit of everything. And as you walk in the door on the right side, there was this small magazine display, really, where the top part was magazines, of course, and the bottom part were comic books. Now, I'd read comic books before, obviously. I read Richie Rich and Casper the Friendly Ghost and, some other things, I'm sure. But never really had read any of the... I'm sure I'd seen them, I just don't remember them, any superhero comics. And when I walked in that store with this one guy, I immediately gravitated towards that rack. And what did I spy? And immediately grabbed, and I don't know why I grabbed these, but I did. I bought that very night and took home with me Amazing Spider-Man number 187, which features Captain America battling Spider-Man on the cover with Electro, his shadow in the background, so he's the villain of it. And the cover even says Marvel's TV sensation, which, okay, right there, that's probably why I grabbed that one, because I had watched the Amazing Spider-Man television series, I'm sure that very year. I'm probably mixing up stuff in my head, but I do remember watching the Spider-Man television series about this same time, so I think that's probably why I bought that. And of course, Spider-Man being forefront in my mind, I also picked up Marvel Tales number 98, which is just a reprint of Amazing Spider-Man number 121, where Gwen Stacy dies at Peter's hands while he's fighting the Green Goblin, which, I tell you what, that story just amazed me to no end. The fact that this character that Spider-Man loves is, not only is she killed, but she's killed at his own hand. And that whole bit, and hopefully this isn't a spoiler for something that's so old, but you never know, right? When Gwen gets knocked off the bridge by the Goblin, Spider-Man throws his webbing down to catch her. the webbing grabs her leg as she's falling down, and then in that one little panel where it's just her kind of upside down, falling down, and you see the webbing go up above the panel, and then there's a little tiny word right next to her head that says snap. That was amazing and unforgettable. I love that comic, and I love that whole story. So I got 2 Spider-Man comics that very night, and I also happened to grab, and I don't know why I grabbed this, because I didn't know, I don't think I did anyway. I grabbed an Avengers comic, which was issue number 177, which was part of the Korvac storyline. And this is the one where all the Avengers and the Guardians of the Galaxy come together and try to defeat Korvac. And, of course, Korvac defeats them. In fact, kills most of the superheroes that attack him. In the very end, of course, the dead superheroes are resurrected through Korvac's bell, and then the issue ends basically with Dr. Blake, Thor's alter ego, trying to revive and treat all of the Avengers. So that was an amazing comic in that, to me, in that you have all the, this massive amount of characters in the Avengers comic going up against this one guy with cosmic power. And even though they know they can't hope to defeat them, like Hawkeye, he's got trick arrows. How does he go up against something like that? But yet he does, as do many of the characters. So to see that, to see, well, now, so this has been several years ago, and I just realized I got 2 comics where there's death involved. Obviously very heavily in the Avengers comic, but also in that Marvel Tales. But so obviously that made an impression to me. So I bought those 3 comics, took them back to our new home, and I remember that my mother was not pleased with me. I think she thought that my buying comics was a waste of money. Maybe she didn't want me to get into comics, because it had a certain stigma attached to it, and she was worried about me because I was already a real quiet guy, kind of mousy. I like to read a lot, and I kept to myself. So I don't know. Over the years that changed. She kind of accepted that. But that very night I don't remember exactly anything that she said, but I am left all these years later with this impression that she was not happy with me buying those comics. Of course, the boyfriend came and went. We eventually moved back to our hometown, so I could reunite with the rest of my family and friends, and I kept buying comics from then on. And still to this day. In fact, I've never stopped buying comics monthly ever since that month. I know that, a lot of people, they get into high school or even college, their college years, and they stop getting that stuff. One, maybe because they don't have enough money, which that was always, except for the last maybe 10 years, that actually was a problem in my life, in that I didn't buy a lot of other things that, my friends did. I didn't, buy a lot of, here's an old word for you, friends, records, or CDs later, things like that. I didn't buy a lot of clothes. Any extra money that I could get went to buying comics. So but I kept with it. I've loved it ever since that first night, and haven't stopped, and don't plan on it either. So that's basically my secret origin, if you will. So how do we get from 1978, where I start buying comics and I buy comics through the rest of my life so far, to doing what I'm doing now, which is talking to you through a podcast? Well, I decided back in February of 2007 that it wasn't enough just to read comics and talk about them with my friends, face to face. I wanted to get my thoughts out there, one, to coalesce them into some form, and also to, communicate to those out there who might be interested in this stuff, who might even start a dialogue with me, which has always been my goal with the blog that I started back in 2007, and then continuing on to the podcast. So I did start blogging about my comics. This was on LiveJournal for those that may know about that platform. And then about 2 years later, this again October 2009, so I moved over to Blogspot, where actually that's where Long Box Review first originated, was on Blogspot. So if you go back and listen to those early episodes, you'll hear me say longboxreview.blogspot.com, and let me tell you, that can be a tongue twister sometimes. I messed that up so many times I had to edit those. So anyway, that's why if you listen to those early episodes, I'm actually promoting a website that doesn't even exist anymore. Then after Blogspot for not quite a year, I decided I didn't quite care for Blogspot. There were some issues with maintenance of the blog, and so I looked around and asked people for their opinions, and saw some people on WordPress, which I knew of, but I hadn't really had any dealings with it. But I moved the Longbox Review blog over to WordPress. This was in July of 2010, and I remember setting this up. I'm in a hotel room. I don't remember. I think it was Seattle. It may have been Portland. But my family and I traveled to whichever city it was to attend a concert, I believe. And I'm sitting in there with my laptop connected to the hotel's wireless connection, and I set up my WordPress blog that night. And I'm getting yelled at from my wife because we're supposed to be watching this movie that we rented on the in the room for the TV in the room. And I wasn't interested in the movie. I told her that to begin with, but I'm laying there and I'm on the computer and she was yelling at me. But anyway, which happens quite a lot actually. When we go on trips and the family's watching TV or doing something, and I'm on the computer. Anyway, so started the WordPress site. And I had actually done the very first episode of the podcast, which I called episode 0. I had recorded that sometime in June or July of 2010, and put it out there. I originally had it on my SkyDrive account because I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to really continue doing that, like I have been, like I am now. So I just kind of put that out there and just kind of see the response I would get. And then I discovered that some people had problems accessing that file on SkyDrive. I tried to do it so that you could stream it, and that didn't work. And then tried doing the download, and sometimes it would work, and sometimes it wouldn't. People kept telling me the link was broken, and I'm like, okay, forget this. So then I decided that I would actually do a proper podcast, host the files in the appropriate place, and so I started searching around for the place to do that. And I looked at Libsyn, and I looked at Podbean, and there were a few others that I looked at too. I can't remember what other hosting sites I did look for, or look at. But eventually, actually, I started both. I started a Libsyn account and a Podbean account because I wasn't sure which one I wanted to go with. Now I know I should have went with one over the other, and it's not the one I'm with now. But that's okay because in some ways, which is Podbean, because Podbean does kind of give you a slightly bit more for your money, in depending on what tier plan you go with, and my plan is not like the mega one. But over the few years I've been doing this now, I've come to realize that I probably should have went with Libsyn and paid twice as much, but I probably wouldn't have some of the potential issues that I have with Podbean. And one of the issues I do have with Podbean is the user interface for doing everything, for loading the file and all that stuff. But that's a minor thing. I think I get pretty good for what I'm paying. So I'm satisfied with it. I know there are some detractors out there, and I completely understand their points of view. So anyway, So I did. I released the first episode, which was episode 0. And if you have been following the podcast for any length of time, you know how I rant against 0 issues of comics, which is ironic, right? I did start out with an episode 0 where I reviewed a Brave and the Bold issue number 34. And I released that on July 1st, 2010. And then followed it up very quickly with episode 1 of the podcast. This is when I really decided, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm gonna review comics and talk about comics, and I'm gonna actually do a proper podcast. And so that's that very same month, but at the end of the month, I released episode 1, which was a review of, and it was very fortunate too. It was kind of like this big deal that at that time period. Batman 700, Superman 700, and Wonder Woman 600 all came out that month. So I did that, and then I continued to do basically what we call a single voice podcast, right? Where it's just me talking about this stuff. And I did that for a couple more episodes through episode 3. And the whole time I'm thinking, what this really needs is another voice on the podcast. It should be a conversation. It shouldn't just be me throwing out all the stuff like I'm doing now to the listeners. So I while I'm recording these first 4 episodes of the podcast from July 2010 through January 2011. See, there was a big gap there between episode 2 and 3. I had started working on my friend Travis, who is my sometimes co-host on the podcast, to join me, and finally convinced him, and that's when I released episode 4, where I had a conversation with him. That was in May of 2011. And then, of course, DC shortly after that decided to announce their relaunch, the New 52, and Travis and I got a lot of mileage out of that. We talked many episodes about everything leading up to the relaunch, reviewing all of the books. We even did a quick 6-month review in. We're not going to do a year-long thing, unless it just happens to come up in a future episode. And of course, I do intend to have Travis on. It's mostly just our schedules and how that all works out. Plus, he's very busy doing his own video casts. He does them by himself, and he also does them with his son, where they review comics on there. So you should go check that out. Go search on YouTube for The Gaunt Man, and you'll be able to find those. Those are fun to watch and listen to. All right, so here I am. I'm now 32 episodes in. I kind of think of this. I just mentioned the DC relaunch. I kind of think of this as kind of a relaunch, a refresher for the podcast, and I'm going to be doing some more stuff, as I hinted at earlier. I have to give some credit for this. I've been listening to. Well, okay. Let me back up just a second. See, back in episode 28 and 29, I had a couple episodes with Peter Rios, and he announced during episode 29 that he would be returning back to podcasting. For those who don't know, Peter Rios was a founding member of the Comic Geek Speak podcast, which was the original inspiration for me to do my own podcast, because that was the first comic book related podcast that I listened to. I still do. Anyway, Peter left a little over a year ago, I believe, and then he decided that he wanted to get back into it. Announced it on my show on episode 29, and he's come back with the Daily Rios. So you can go check that out at thedailyrios.com, where he does, as has been described, a bit of podcast verite. So he didn't come back and do just a comic book podcast. He talks about things happening in his life, TV he's watching. He's in a musical theater, so he talks about musicals, which I find all that really great stuff and very interesting. So I'm now looking at the podcast thinking, okay, what can I do here? Because I would tend to want to do like event type shows, where, Travis and I, or even just myself, I'll talk about this bit of news here that comes out of DC or Marvel or, Image or whatever. And get some, talk about it, get some reactions, some thoughts about it, maybe a little bit of analysis. Probably not so much of that because I'm not all that great at that. But anyway, I know I could talk about it. That's for sure. Or we'd review specific books or whatever. Kind of what everybody else does. And not to knock anybody else or even that direction in my podcast, but I felt like I could do something different, a little more. And part of that is, when I originally started doing the blog, I was going to review, recent comics, the current comics I'm reading, but really the point was to go, and that's why it's called Long Box Review, was to go back into my long boxes and pull out comics that I've kept, that I've loved, I like to read, even read again, and do reviews of those. Well, I never really did that on the podcast. I did it a few times on the blog, and I enjoyed that immensely. I did the DC Comics Presents, the 3 or 4 issues where Superman first meets Mongol. This is back before, obviously before the New 52, even before Crisis, for that matter. And so there was these great issues of DC Comics Presents, where Superman teams up with Martian Manhunter, Supergirl, and Starman. Not the Golden Age Starman, or even the Starman from the 90s, but the Starman that was created, he was off in space. It was in Adventure Comics. Anyway, you can go look those up at the longboxreview.wordpress.com, and you can search for retro review or DC Comics Presents. Anyway, I'll put a link in the show notes, but I did a review, an in-depth review of those 4 issues, and I always wanted to get back to doing that because there's a lot of great single comic issues in my collection that I'd like to do that, but also, a mini series or a short run of a particular series, or even a long run. I would love to do that if I could find the time to devote to that. And, recently I tweeted that I'd love to do a review of, like the Legion of Superheroes Great Darkness saga, or the New Teen Titans when, with the Terra storyline, where Terra betrays the Titans and Dick Grayson becomes Nightwing for the first time. Things like that. I'd love to get into all those favorites of mine, and, take a look at them now, some almost 30 years later, and see how they hold up, and just talk about them, because a lot of this older stuff, I don't think a lot of people have read, perhaps, or maybe I find out that a lot of people have read them, and they have, you out there have a connection to them too, and maybe we could talk about it in some fashion. So as I said, I was inspired by Peter. During our conversation during those 2 episodes, he mentioned to me, off mic, so to speak, that I reminded him of another podcaster that he listens to. This is Bruce Rosenberger, who does the Comics Cast podcast. And since then, of course, Peter says, we're similar in some fashion. Then, I thought I'd take a look, being curious, and I've been listening to him for a few months now, and I really enjoy that podcast. And what Bruce does is, he talks comics, and it's not always, like I was saying, I do like events and or specific reviews. I mean, he does that kind of stuff too, but they're usually short episodes, and they're usually very focused, and I like that idea, and I think I'm going to incorporate a little bit of that, more of that at least, into the podcast here. So there you go. I'm really looking forward to doing stuff. As I said, I'm going to start doing more reviews of things that are in my collection, especially the older stuff I'd like to do. But I'd also like to do things like newer stuff that I just happen to get into, like the Valiant run, or the Valiant series that have been coming out. I ignored Valiant back when they first came out with stuff. For whatever reason, I don't know. Maybe I didn't have enough money, but there it is. But when the new stuff started coming out here within the last few months, I think. I guess now we're getting up to the 5th or 6th month, right? Anyway, I was challenged by podcast listener Lee to take a look at those, and I did, and I actually really enjoyed one of those titles, Harbinger, and decided that I would pick up the rest of them that had come out at that time. So I'm doing that and slowly reading through those, and hope to be talking about that. I want to talk about the stuff that I read normally that I don't get to really review either on the blog or the podcast. Just little snippets of what I'm reading right now, that kind of stuff. So, and then of course talk about all the other stuff that happens in comics as it happens to come along, and of course Travis will be back. We'll talk. I really enjoy talking with him. He's got great opinions and loves to share them, and I love interacting with him. I had my very old friend Greg come on and talk about the Avengers movie. I hope to have him on more to talk about comics and other media type stuff, because he keeps up with that. He doesn't read a lot of comics right now, but he does watch all the movies, and experiences that stuff. So I'd like to have him back on to talk about those things. And I'll do trade reviews and miniseries and stuff like I mentioned before. Just a lot of different things that I want to get to on the podcast, and like I said, I'm working towards that. So as I mentioned, there are 2 podcasts already that have inspired me or have informed me in some ways, and that's Peter's The Daily Rios and Comics Cast. But there are a bunch of others, since this is a podcast. I do listen to other comic book related podcasts. So I thought I'd take the opportunity now to let you know what I listen to and why, and maybe you should check those out. It's like going to the comic shop in a way, in my fevered brain. So you download these episodes and you hear these other people talking about comic books, and if you're like me, maybe you're talking back as you're listening. I tend to listen to a lot of the podcasts I listen to while I'm driving to and from work. Sometimes I can actually sit down at my desk and listen to them while I'm working. Not often, because I'm a manager and I'm constantly being interrupted and have to go here for this meeting and go over there to put out this fire. And anyway, I don't want to talk about work, because that's part of the reason why I haven't been podcasting. So stop that right now. But so I do listen to podcasts, and I do enjoy the conversation, if you will. It's not really a conversation, but I feel a part of a larger community. And so, while I would love to have everybody listen to my podcast and my podcast be the primary comic book podcast that you listen to, I know that's not going to happen, and I wouldn't want it to, because there should be a plethora of voices out there with all different points of views and different biases and focuses and whatnot. So here are some of the other comic book related podcasts I listen to that I think maybe you should too. So I mentioned the Daily Rios and Comics Cast, but the kind of the granddaddy of them all to me, and I mentioned this before, the inspiration for me doing podcasts to begin with is Comic Geek Speak. So Peter left the show, but Pants and Murd and the other guys are still doing it and releasing episodes. I think 2 or 3 a week, every week, which is amazing. I can't believe, and even before, so when Peter was on there, I think they were doing like 1 episode a weekday, and I don't know how they did it. It's crazy. It's crazy. I can't even imagine. But anyway. They have a lot of connections. They usually have a lot of people that work in comics come on the show. They always, they have a good time together. It's very obvious. I enjoy listening to them. And so that's the main show, but they also have spin-off episodes. One of which is Murd's Time Bubble, which I have enjoyed immensely, and I've listened to all of them. Murd is doing what I kind of described what I'm going to do to some degree, but he has a lot of comics from many years past that basically are in his read pile. And he goes back and takes a look at a few of them every time and talks about them. But he does it in such a intelligent and introspective way that I don't think I've heard anybody else do. So I really appreciate that. Appreciate what he does for that spinoff. After that, one of my very favorite podcasts that I've more recently found is House to Astonish. And this is a couple of guys that live in Great Britain. And they usually give us the news. They talk about new releases that they've read that week, and end it with a look at the official handbook to the Marvel Universe, and pick out an obscure character, something that's funny or interesting in some way, and discuss how that character would work in today's Marvel Comics. But I mostly just enjoy listening to them talk about this stuff. They have, one, it's a different perspective, not just because they're two different guys that I'm not familiar with, but, they're across the pond, as they say, so they have a different country's perspective of comic books. So I really appreciate that. There's another podcast done by a gentleman who lives in Great Britain, and that is the 20-minute long box, where he examines one comic from his collection, randomly chosen, and he looks at it in depth and gives you his analysis of it, and I really enjoy that one. More locally, at least to me, is the Girls Don't Read Comics podcast, which is done by a woman who actually works in the comic book shop that I frequent, but is 80 miles away in Spokane, Washington. She does short podcasts. It's news related, reviews of things that she's read. It's just really quick, but it's nice to have a different perspective, especially someone who works in the retail side. You should check that out. For more news type stuff, I sometimes listen to the Comic Vine podcast, especially when they have James Robinson on there, because he's funny. And also he talks a lot about the stuff he's working on. Robinson is a writer whose work I actually enjoy, especially his Earth 2 stuff coming out. Oh my God, I love that comic. Then there's for insider news and analysis, and just comic creators coming in and talking about their craft and their opinions about things. You have the Word Balloon podcast by John Suntress. I listen to that quite frequently. That's pretty much it for there are some others that I check in on every once in a while. The Comic Book Page. I've listened to a bunch of comic book podcasts over the years. Some of them are really interesting or have really interesting specific episodes that I've listened to, but just not enough to keep me interested long term. And I've gone back to some and dropped them, come back to them again. So in other words, there's a lot of comic book related podcasts out there. Well, just look at iTunes, which, by the way, you can find Longbox Review in iTunes. Search for comic book podcast, and there's like dozens and dozens of podcasts in there. So there's a bunch of stuff to choose from. But my life isn't ruled strictly by comic books, although it's a huge chunk of my life. I listen to some other podcasts too that are interesting and in some cases educational. So I just want to mention those to you in case you are looking for some other entertainment besides comic books and comic book podcasts. So there's one podcast I listen to, the Audacity to Podcast is what it's called. And so because I use Audacity to record the single voice podcasts I do, which is what right now is what I'm using to record this episode, I found this podcast, and I learned all the the ins and outs of using Audacity. The host doesn't just talk about Audacity in relation to podcasts, but he talks about all sorts of things podcast related, which is nice. And then there are a couple media related. One is Down in Front, which is a movie focused podcast where you get a bunch of guys together who actually work in the industry, and they come together and they talk about films, specific films, and they also talk about the industry and their experiences there. And they've been releasing these episodes where it's not movie related, but they talk about things that interest them, like the latest episode, which was it was called Down in Front in Space. And so they talked about, like the space program and their love of, space and they just talked about the Mars rover and the Voyager spacecraft and all. And I love that. That was my first kind of like geek thing that I got into was astronomy and space exploration and soon followed, Star Trek and Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica. And to me, it's kind of like a natural progression from science fiction movies and TV series that I watched when I was a wee lad, and then getting into comic books, superhero comic books. To me, that's like just a natural progression. So I enjoy that. There's also the Nerdist podcast, if you're familiar with that. The Nerdist is also on BBC America now with a few specials. Chris Hardwick brings on movie and TV guests, but usually it's a geek slant. So, he like the latest episode he just released has Michael Dorn from Star Trek The Next Generation on it. He talks to people whom geeks love, I think, or at least some of us anyway. So that's always interesting. But, okay, for my final one, I'll get out of here. This American Life. If you want compelling, engaging, interesting slices of life stories, you will find no other or better podcast than this. This is when I want a good story, and I'm not talking just it's not fiction, although they do read poems and short fiction on the air, but they do investigative stories. They do tell these really interesting stories. Like the one I'm listening to right now is about a kid who was kidnapped and then found several months later, and maybe that kid isn't the kid they thought he was, that kind of a thing. But it's so engaging, so interesting, and I love it. And I try to promote that podcast to whomever I can because it's such good storytelling, such good radio drama, podcast drama. So, you can listen to it on the radio because it's an NPR thing, but they also release a podcast as well, which is how I listen to it. So there you go. That's a bunch of podcasts I listen to. I really appreciate the fact that you listen to this podcast, and I will be doing a lot more stuff in the future. Cross my fingers. And I hope to hear back from you. As Peter Rios says, I believe he was quoting somebody else whose name I can't recall at the moment, but the listener feedback is the lifeblood of a podcast. And, please get a hold of me. And there's several ways you can do that. You can leave comments at the blog at longboxreview.wordpress.com. You can email me, longboxreview@gmail.com. There's the Facebook page as well. iTunes reviews, leave an iTunes review. That's always great. The more reviews that I get there, the higher profile the podcast becomes, and more people can see it, they can listen to it. At least they can see it in iTunes and they can download it and listen to it. You know what I mean. But there you go. Please get a hold of me. I'd love to hear from you, and I always answer any and all queries I get, whether it's on the blog or through email or wherever. I think that's it. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you soon.